Hi, welcome to the video. Today I want to talk about fat synth sounds and how to get them out of the deluge and what makes a fat synth sound. Thank you so much for all the positive comments and feedback I got for the last video. Very humbled, and thank you. It's really appreciated. Hopefully this one will be as interesting, if not more. So what goes into making a fat synth sound? Well, let's take a look. This synth here is a Behringer Model D. This is a copy of an original Moog, which is very sought after, but the difference in price between an original second-hand Moog and the Behringer version is probably enough for you to be able to buy a car or put a deposit on a flat. So Behringer is not quite as good as the original, but it still does a very good job of it. And the reason I've chosen it is because it has 3 oscillators. Moog make some very decent kits, some absolutely lovely synths, including the Mother 32, which I like very much. But that does only have 1 oscillator, even though it sounds great. So it's easier this time to use something like the Behringer just to demonstrate what I mean. What makes a fat synth sound? Well, 2 main things: fat oscillators and a fat filter. There's a bunch of other things that can help, but basically if you've got those 2 building blocks, you're well on the way. And what is a fat synth sound? Well, organic, deep, rich, moving kind of sounds that you get, not the thin and reedy and thin sounds you can get out of some pieces of kit. What you want is an evolving richness, a depth that is just kind of says analog, really. There's lots of digital stuff that will do similar things, lots of plugins. In general, analog is associated with more richness and fatness, simply because inside an analog piece of kit are transistors and things that warm up and move over time. So the whole thing becomes a little bit more organic anyway. And that's certainly the case with this synth. It has a switch up this end just off screen, which will give you a tuning, A440 tuning noise, so you can actually tune the oscillators when they go out of tune on this one, exactly the same as the original. Anyway, so let's take a look just at the oscillator section. So this bit here are the oscillators, and let's specifically look at just 1 oscillator here. We'll have everything else on the synth just turned up, so it's just a pure oscillator, and it sounds like that. I can change the waveform of the oscillator to sort of sine saw, sawtooth, square, pulse width type of stuff, and I can change the range, the pitch in octaves. But that is it. Inside this synth, that sound is going on non-stop. It's opening up and being heard because I can play it on a MIDI keyboard or a button on the Deluge like now. But that is the sound of that oscillator. And there's a volume as well here. There's a second oscillator which you can switch on, which immediately has a difference to the sound. Now this oscillator here has exactly the same. If I turn off the first one, we're back to the same kind of sounds, but as you can see, this one has a tuning knob. So if I put them both together, we're instantly fatter, and these are moving slightly between the 2 of them. So you're not just having a very simple, straight, flat oscillator times 2 doing exactly the same thing. They're just doing that a little bit. Of course, you can go very extreme and tune one completely out, but as long as they're moving, it just makes the sound more interesting. And to make matters even better, there's a third oscillator down here, which I can put to the same octave, switch it on. Suddenly we've got something even bigger. So we went from 1 oscillator to 2 oscillators to 3 oscillators. And by changing the waveforms and the volume, you can get completely different effects going on. So that is our starting noise. And the way that these synths work is by subtractive synthesis. That means that you start with a big fat noise, which is what we've just created with our oscillators, and then you remove chunks of that noise, treble, bass, middle, whatever, to end up with the sound that you want to hear. And you do that bit with a filter. But unless you've started with a great big fat sound, you're not going to get anything like a fat sound out the other end. So fat oscillators and fat filters. So let's take a quick look at the filters. And here we've got a filter section over this end. So I'll just move it along a bit so you can see what's going on. Oscillators were here. We'll keep all three on for now. Filter, main two filter controls are up here. There's a cutoff frequency and a resonance. The cutoff frequency simply cuts off the frequency, funnily enough, of the oscillators. This one is set to low pass, so it allows low sounds through, and you'll hear, as I do that, it ends up with nothing, and then lets the low sound through and ends up with the brassy top end coming through. If you flick this switch, it will do the opposite. It's a high pass, so if you start at the bottom, you hear all the sound, and then if you wind it up, you lose the bottom end. And this one doesn't actually finish with nothing like the low pass. You do end up with a bit of high left. So go back to low pass. This one is called emphasis, but other people call it resonance. And that boosts the frequency at the cutoff point. But basically what that means is it sort of whistles a little bit, raspiness a little bit around where that's set, makes for a bit more interest. Now there's a bunch of other things you can do with envelopes. You can change that filter over the course of time so that you can give it a plucky sound on the front or a fade in. You can affect it with LFOs, which are low frequency oscillators, slow things that could alter the pitch or alter the filter again. But basically that source sound comes from the oscillators and the filter. So if we just put all the filter back to wide open, the emphasis down, we're back to where we started. 3 oscillators, we'll leave it like that. That's where we're at. So now let's take a look at the Deluge. So here is my Deluge back in position, and this thing is effectively a digital machine. It has digital oscillators, digital filters, it samples digitally. There's not that many transistors or solid state kind of electronics inside it that would drift. It's designed to be pretty rock solid. That doesn't mean to say that it doesn't sound warm. You can use the digital side of things to emulate warmth and introduce movement, but it still sounds a bit cleaner than the way the Behringer would sound. So if we just load up an empty, well, have a listen to actually to some of the synths that are built in. So there is a synth sound. You can cycle through presets. Now obviously these aren't raw oscillators. These are sounds that have been modified. But if we flip into a raw oscillator sound, so we just initialize the synth, there is a raw oscillator. Now, that oscillator can be set to different waveforms, exactly the same as we had before. So it's currently set to a square wave, saw wave, sine wave, triangle. And there are 2 oscillators. So if I add the second one, because currently it's turned down, hear that the sound changes. But to be fair, it's not going to sound like a 3 oscillator synth that's coming out of the Moog, even though the Moog's down an octave. You can still tell that that is weaker. Let's turn this down an octave to be fair. Of course it's going to change on the Moog. Let me flip the Moog up. There we go. So you can hear the difference, and that's really not a fair comparison, but it shows you that the inbuilt oscillators in the Deluge, unless you start really working with it, are going to be different to the oscillators, of which there are 3 on the Moog. Now, there are ways around this. The Deluge has an awesome little trick up its sleeve that allows it to compete on pretty much a very level playing field. There is a way to take the oscillators internally on the Deluge and replace them with sampled sounds or anything that you want to use, which gives you a great leap forward in the thickness of your source fat oscillators. You're not limited to the, albeit pretty good, sound sources that are based internally, you can go and find whatever fat sounds that you want and use those as oscillators. And I've been very impressed with the sound quality that's been coming out of this thing when you sample. It's very realistic in what comes out as to what you sample in. So with that said, why don't we just sample this very thick sounding wonderful Moog and use its combination of 3 oscillators, or 2 or 1, as a single oscillator within the Deluge and see what that sounds like. Okay, so I'm going to take my trusty sampling jack cable, plug one end into the Behringer. Behringer has a really useful plug on the top actually that sends an audio out, as well as being on the back, which I think it has 2 on the back. Plug it into the line in the Deluge, and then let's take a look at what's going on. I have a MIDI track set up that's playing the Behringer, just as I had before to show you what was going on that front. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a note all the way through, like that, so that when I play the Deluge, it plays the Behringer. Now the next thing I want to do is create a synth track on the Deluge. We'll make it a new synth. So there it is, a default synth track with the default square wave or sine wave or whatever's coming out with it by default. And we're going to tell it that rather than play those internal oscillators, I want to sample something to use as an oscillator instead. So what I do is I hold a pad down and hit load. Rather than mess around worrying about start and end points, what I'm going to literally do is hit play to hear the Behringer and then hit record to record the sample that's going in. So here we go. Hit record. So that's now just simply recording a nice long note that's coming out from the Behringer, and we'll hit stop. Now, I'm not going to play hugely long chords coming out of the Deluge. So probably, and none of my chords will last much longer than what I've sampled. I could have sampled it for 3 minutes if I want. Version 2 of the Deluge software about to come out will stream audio directly from the card by default. So you could have a 10-minute long sample if you want. If you want to do this stuff nice and properly and tidy, then sample a short section and make sure that it loops with no glitches on it so that the end of the sample matches up to the beginning of the sample. But here I really don't care. I've got this sample now. If I play it, that's what I've just sampled, and it will just carry on. Now, I think you'll agree that's a pretty fat synth sound coming out of the Deluge, and so it should be, because it's one oscillator coming out, 3 oscillators of the Behringer coming out, playing on one oscillator on the Deluge. And if I want to play around with that, we can mess around with things like the internal filter on here. Now that isn't half bad. And the resonance. It's not 100% in line with the way the Behringer's working, but it's really not bad. I would say the limitation on the Deluge using internal sounds is far more about the oscillator and the fatness of the oscillators than it is the filter. And bear in mind, again, version 2 of the Deluge software we're not running here has new filtering, new analog emulated filtering on it, which is sounding good. So although the filter is, I think, the lesser of the limitation, it's getting better and better and better. And of course, there's one other thing with this that I can do, which I can't do on the Behringer, which is if I just take the filter down a little bit, I can play chords. Behringer only plays one note at a time, right? So So we're really laughing at this point, and we've only used one oscillator on the Deluge. There's another one that we can load a sample into and tune it away and so forth. And what you'll find is when you start doing this stuff is actually the original sample from the Behringer is too fat for the Deluge. If you want to start playing chords on a monophonic 3 oscillator fat synth, you do run out of fatness and it starts just going splurgy and nasty after a while. It's just one of those things. So you could start with a thinner version and then add a second oscillator version of it on the Deluge, or a completely new sample, and mix them together. And so the final other thing I can do, we'll make this a reasonably short video, is that I can start playing the internal synth sound that I've created on the Deluge from an external synthesizer. Just taking the MIDI out of this Arturia matrix brute and plugging it into the Deluge allows me to play that synth sound. And not only that, I can map some of the knobs on the Arturia to do things like the filter cutoff or the resonance or the envelopes and all that kind of stuff. So here is our synth that we've created on the Deluge, ready to go. If I hold down Shift and Learn and hit one of the pads and then just touch the note on the Arturia, I'm now playing the Deluge, and notice that it's touch sensitive. So it's a very easy way of recording into the Deluge touch sensitive notes, because these pads on the Deluge here are not touch sensitive. You can adjust the velocity really easily, but fundamentally they're not touch sensitive. So now I can just simply go back and I can play this very fat sounding synth, which is a Deluge synth, and adjust the filter and the resonance. Secondly, last thing I can show you is on the matrix brute, we have a filter knob here. Doesn't do anything at the moment. If I take the frequency cutoff on here, on the Deluge, which is this flashing button here, and I do the same process, I just hold Learn down and twist the knob up here, this filter is now changing the Deluge filter. So you go and have a closer look. Whilst I adjust the filter up here, you might be able to see that the number here is changing. So if I play on the matrix brute, I'm not even touching the Deluge at all now, which is awesome. And you can map absolutely virtually everything on that synth, or any synth, any knob, could be anything, could be any controller, could be whatever you want, to the Deluge. So that's how you get a really fat sound on the synth on the Deluge. Thanks ever so much for watching.